My name is Alexander Young. I ran tunnel boring machines for 31 years, and I can tell you this. Every machine has a sound before it fails. Not a warning light, not an alarm. A sound, a shift in the hum, a hesitation in the thrust, a hitch you feel through your boots before you ever hear it. I told them. They laughed. Then the tunnel drowned. Before we jump back into today's story, I've got some exciting news. We've officially launched a brand new channel called Tales Beneath Skin, and that's where all our stories are heading from now on. If you can't get enough of blue-collar work revenge stories, this is the place for you. Brutal bosses getting what they deserve, satisfying workplace payback, and the kind of justice you love to see, and we never leave you hanging. We track down every update and plot twist so you get the complete story, start to finish, all in one place. So make sure you head over and subscribe to Tales Beneath Skin right now so you don't miss a single story. You'll find the link in the description, the pinned comment, and the collaboration tag. Now, back to it. The machine had a sound. That's the first thing I want you to understand. Not a spec sheet. Not a data readout. A sound. Low, steady, somewhere between a diesel idling and a mountain clearing its throat. When she was happy, she hummed. When she was tired, she groaned. When she was about to hit bad ground, she went quiet in a way that made the hair on your arms stand up. And if you had been running her long enough, you knew, the way you know when your wife is angry with you and hasn't said so yet, that something was wrong. I ran that kind of machine for 31 years. Different names, different projects, different clients. Sewer tunnels under Chicago, a rail bore outside Seattle, water conveyance out in the desert where the muck came up dry as chalk. But it was always the same trade. You stood in the operator's cabin, hands on a console, and you listened. You watched the thrust pressure the way a doctor watches a heartbeat. You felt the vibration through the deck plate. You smelled the Cutterhead when it was chewing granite versus when it was chewing clay. And yes, I said smell. Rock has a smell. Anyone who's ever laid their palm on hot steel after a good bite will tell you the same. They call it embodied knowledge when the university men write papers about it. On the job site, we just called it doing the work. By the time I got hired onto the mill race project, I was 60, gray in the beard, hearing shot in the left ear from years of hydraulic slam. My knees complained on the ladder down, but there wasn't a machine on that continent. I couldn't read inside a shift, and the company knew it. That's why they brought me on. For a while, that mattered. I came into the trade in 1984 out of a 2-year technical program and a bad back from farm work. My first foreman was a man named Frank Petroglia, Sicilian father, Polish mother, hands like catcher's mitts. He'd worked the Chesapeake outfall in the 70s and had lost the tip of one finger to a gripper shoe he trusted a half second too long. He used the stub to point at things, and when he pointed at you, you paid attention. Frank taught me to listen, not to the alarms. Anyone can listen to an alarm, but to the machine underneath the alarms. He'd stand behind me in the cabin, arms folded, and just wait. If I reached for a control too fast, he'd cluck his tongue. If I reached too slow, he'd say, "You feel that? You feel her walking sideways on you?" And I'd nod like I did. And then eventually, one shift or another, I did. He died in 1998, emphysema. I went to the funeral in a rented suit and shook hands with a widow I'd only met twice. And I remember thinking, driving home afterwards in the rain with the wipers going, that a man like Frank could not really die, because half of what he knew was still moving around in me, and the other men he'd trained. That was a nice thing to believe. It turns out it was only half true. The mill race project was a water conveyance job, a little over a mile of tunnel through mixed ground, sandy soils on the entry end, harder stuff further in, and a stretch about halfway through that the geotechnical reports flagged in yellow. Flagged, not red. Yellow means probably fine. Watch it. I had worked plenty of yellow ground in my life. Yellow ground was where you earned your money. I was hired as senior operator. 2 shifts, 3-man crew per shift. 1 apprentice under my wing. Good crew. Danny Ochoa, the junior engineer, was the sharpest of the lot. A quiet kid, glasses always fogged from the humidity down tunnel, notebook in his back pocket. He'd stand behind me during the hard passes the way I used to stand behind Frank. For the first 8 months, the job ran clean. We hit our advance rates. The Cutterhead behaved. The muck came out wet and gray and steady, load after load, and every night I drove home to Marlene and slept, the sleep of a man whose hands had done honest work. Then Carter Hill showed up. He came in on a Monday, company SUV, pressed shirt, a haircut that cost more than my boots, introduced himself in a site trailer with a handshake he'd clearly practiced, firm, two-pump, held your eye a beat too long. Carter Hill, new operations manager, fresh out of some management restructure, back at corporate. He was maybe 35, wore a hard hat like a hat, not like a tool. You can always tell. A man who has actually needed a hard hat wears it low, tight, adjusted for the weight. A man who has never needed one wears it perched, like it might blow off. "Alex, right?" he said, reading my name off a printout. 31 years. Impressive. "Alexander," I said, not to correct him, just to introduce myself the way I introduce myself. He smiled the way men smile when they've already decided what you are. "Alexander, great. Look forward to working with you." For the first 2 weeks, he mostly stayed in the trailer, slides, spreadsheets, calls with corporate. He'd come down to the portal occasionally, in a fresh set of coveralls that never got dirty, and ask questions that a first year would have known the answers to. I answered them plain. I never had patience for a lot of talk, but I've never been rude to a man for not knowing something. Not knowing is how you start. The problem wasn't the not knowing. The problem was what he did with it. He'd been hired, I gathered soon enough, to modernize the operation. Corporate had bought into a new automated guidance and performance optimization system, a whole software package that promised, in the sales brochure I later saw on his desk, to reduce operator variability and improve advance rates through algorithmic control. That's the phrase. Operator variability, meaning me, meaning the crew, meaning the fact that when Danny Ochoa raised the thrust 0.5% because he felt a shudder, that was variability, and variability was inefficient, and inefficient was the enemy. The system went live in month 9. Carter walked the site that afternoon like a man showing off a new car. He clapped me on the shoulder in the operator's cabin. I remember it because he didn't ask before he did, and said, "This is going to make your life so much easier, Alexander. You just supervise." The computer handles the calls. I looked at the screen. Green lights all the way across. Pressures nominal. Advance rate nominal. Ground conditions nominal. Underneath the console, to the deck plate, I could feel the Cutterhead running a hair rough. Not much. A hitch in the rhythm, maybe once every 4 rotations. The kind of thing you'd miss if you were watching the screen. I didn't say anything about it that day. Not to him. I told Danny on the walk back up tunnel. He nodded and wrote it in his book. That was the first tell. A Cutterhead doesn't lie. It can't. It's a wheel of steel and tungsten teeth, chewing through whatever the earth puts in front of it, and whatever the earth puts in front of it, the machine tells you about, if you're listening. The teeth wear differently in different ground. The torque draws differently. The muck comes out with a different weight, a different color, a different smell. Ground talks. The machine translates. For 2 weeks after the software went live, I watched the Cutterhead develop what I can only call a limp. It wasn't dramatic. If you'd walked into the cabin cold, you wouldn't have heard it. The screens all said green. The advance rate held. The muck cars came out and got hauled up and dumped and came back down. To the software, everything was fine. To the software, we were ahead of schedule. But every 4th or 5th rotation, there was a beat that didn't belong. A tiny pause in the thrust. A hesitation, like a runner catching a stitch and pushing through. The system compensated for it instantly. Bumped the pressure, a whisper. Corrected. Kept going. Green, green, green. I sat with it for 3 shifts before I said anything. I wanted to be sure. On the 4th shift, I went up to the trailer with Danny's notebook in my hand. Danny had been logging it too. Thrust irregularities, timestamps, ground signatures. Neat handwriting. Kid was going to be a good engineer someday. Carter was on a call. I waited outside the door until he was done. He waved me in with 2 fingers, still typing. "Something wrong, Alexander. Cutterhead's got a hitch," I said. "About 1 rotation in 4. Started around chainage 2240. He glanced at the screen behind him. "System's not flagging anything. System's compensating. It doesn't know what to flag. Ground ahead of us is turning." "Turning how?" I paused. This is the part that's hard to explain to a man who has never stood in a tunnel. The yellow flag zone in the geotech report. We're getting close. The muck's coming out with more fines than it should. There's water in it that wasn't in it last week. The Cutterhead's telling me the face isn't uniform anymore. Some of it's soft, some of it's hard, and there's something between them that isn't either. He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's already decided you're wrong and is trying to be polite about it. Alexander, I appreciate the input. Really. But the sensor array on this system is picking up 62 data streams in real time. If there was a ground condition change of the magnitude you're describing, we'd see it. You'd see it after, I said, not before. He smiled. He had a smile for these moments I was learning. Patient. A little sad the way you'd look at an old dog that had started forgetting where the door was. Let's monitor, he said. Flag it in the shift report. If the numbers start showing something, we'll respond. I stood there a second longer than I needed to. Then I set Danny's notebook on his desk, open to the log page. That's the flag, I said, and I left. He never opened it. I know because when I went back for it 2 days later, the notebook was exactly where I'd left it, and the coffee ring from his mug had bled through onto the entry for the day I'd walked in. It was a Thursday. I remember because Marlene had bus route parent-teacher pickup that afternoon, which meant I'd taken my own truck to work instead of catching the shuttle. Small detail. Sticks with you. Carter called me into the trailer at the end of shift. He had a man from HR on the video screen, some woman in a blazer sitting in an office 3 states away. That was the tell right there, before he even opened his mouth. You don't loop in HR from 3 states away to give a man a raise. Alexander, thanks for coming up. Have a seat. I didn't sit. I've never liked sitting for bad news. He went through the language. I won't bother repeating it. There's a way corporate people talk when they're firing you, and it's the same in every industry. Restructuring, evolving needs, transition. Thank you for your years of service. The woman on the screen nodded at each phrase like she was checking boxes. I let him finish. He had to. It's easier for them if you let them finish. When he was done, he leaned back in his chair and did the thing I remember most. He laughed. Not a mean laugh, not a triumphant one, a small dismissive laugh. The kind a man lets out when he thinks he's said something clever and wants you to know he knows it. Look, Alexander, he said, at the end of the day, the computer runs the machine now. That's just the reality. We're paying legacy overhead for a role the system has effectively absorbed. You've had a great career. This is a natural transition point. Legacy overhead. I've thought about those 2 words a lot since. Legacy, meaning old. Overhead, meaning a cost, not a value. In 2 words, he had summarized what 31 years of my life were worth to the ledger, and he had done it without knowing he'd done it, which is somehow the part that stays with you. The woman on the screen slid a document over some digital fence to a printer in the trailer. Carter fetched it, laid it in front of me. Severance agreement, non-disparagement clause, a pen. Take your time reviewing it, he said. We'll need the badge and the site keys before you leave today, obviously. I looked at the paper, I looked at him, I looked at the pen. Then I reached to my belt and unclipped the badge, the plastic company badge with my photo on it, taken 8 months ago, before the beard had come in fully gray, and I set it on the desk. I set the site key next to it. I set the pen down on top of the papers without signing anything. You'll be hearing from us if you want the severance, the HR woman said from her office 3 states away. That's fine, I said. And that was all I said. I want you to hear me on that. I didn't argue. I didn't warn him. I didn't tell him what I told him already about the Cutterhead, because I had already told him, and he had already laughed, and a man does not say the same true thing twice to someone who has decided it isn't true. I walked out of the trailer. I walked past the portal. I walked to the parking lot where my truck was, and I got in, and I sat there for a minute with my hands on the wheel because my hands were shaking, and I did not want to drive with hands that were shaking. Danny Ochoa saw me from across the yard. He started walking over. I shook my head at him, one small shake, and he stopped. He understood. Good kid. I drove home. The badge stayed on the desk. The tunnel kept boring behind me. And somewhere ahead of the Cutterhead, in ground the sensors hadn't seen yet, the earth was waiting. Marlene knew before I said anything. She always did. She was at the counter when I came in, cutting green beans. and she looked up at me once, and her hand slowed, and she set the knife down. "They let you go," she said. I nodded. She wiped her hands on the towel at her hip. She didn't come over and hug me. She knew better than that on a day like this. She just poured a cup of coffee, black the way I take it, and set it on the table in the spot where I always sat. And then she went back to the beans. That was Marlene. 34 years of marriage. She knew when to move toward you and when to let you sit. I sat. The coffee was hot. The kitchen smelled like green beans, and the pot roast she'd started earlier. And outside the window over the sink, the maple in the backyard was starting to turn. October coming. Cold nights coming. When? She said after a while. Today. About an hour ago. Severance, they offered. Didn't sign yet. You going to? I thought about it. Probably. Eventually. There's a non-disparagement in it. She snorted a little. Like you were going to go on the news. That got the first small smile out of me. She always could. She finished the beans and put them in the pot. Then she came and sat down across from me with her own cup and put her hand flat on the table, palm down, not reaching for mine, just near. You told them something was wrong, she said. It wasn't a question. I'd been talking to her about the software for weeks, about the hitch, about the Janny's notebook, about Carter's smile. I told them. And the computer runs the machine now. She looked at me a long second. Then she said, "Quiet." Well, it doesn't. I didn't answer that. I didn't need to. We sat there in the kitchen while the pot roast went, and the light through the window changed from afternoon to evening, and neither of us said much. I remember thinking, and I'll be honest with you here, that I was more tired than I was angry. 31 years is a long time to hold a thing up. And setting it down, even in the wrong way, on the wrong day, at the wrong man's desk, it still felt, in some small back corner of me, like setting something down. I'd sleep that night. That surprised me. What I didn't know, sitting there at that table with my wife and my coffee and the maple going red outside the window, was that 600 feet under the ground, 38 miles away, the machine I had run was already beginning to walk sideways on the man who had replaced me with a spreadsheet. It just hadn't happened yet. Word travels in this trade. It has to. There aren't that many of us. Tunnel people. Real tunnel people. And every project shares crew with the last one and the next one. A foreman in Ohio hears about a bind in Oregon by Wednesday. A Cutterhead engineer in Toronto knows by Friday what advance rates they're hitting under Boston. It's a small world under the ground. So when the mill race project started slipping schedule, I heard about it. Not because I asked. Because the phone started ringing. First call came about 3 weeks after I handed in the badge. An old friend from the Chicago days, Marty Ruane, retired now, lives up in Duluth, keeps track of everything the way retired tunnelmen do. "Alex, heard you're off mill race." "Heard right." "Heard they're behind." "Wouldn't know." He was quiet a moment. Then, advance rates dropped 40%, is what I heard. They're chewing through cuttered teeth twice as fast as the plan called for. Somebody I know saw the muck reports. I didn't say anything. "Alex," Marty said, "you knew this was coming." "I knew something was coming. I didn't know what shape it would take." "You warned them." "I warned them." He grunted. That's all a man like Marty needs to say. A grunt from Marty Ruane is a full paragraph. I hung up and went out to the shop. Marlene has a garden behind the house, and I'd been building her a new potting bench. Cedar, hand-planed, the kind of slow work my hands have been missing without knowing it. I stood at the vise and pulled a curl of shaving off a board and watched it fall to the floor. 40%. That was the number that sat in my chest. 40% means the ground had turned, and the software was still running the same program. 40% means the operators up in the cabin were watching green lights while the Cutterhead ground itself down against something it wasn't built to grind. 40% means Carter Hill had a spreadsheet in front of him that said things were fine, and a job site under his feet that was telling him, in a language he didn't speak, that they were not. I could see it. I could see the cabin, the shift boss looking sideways at the screens, wondering if he should call up tunnel. I could see the muck coming out heavier, wetter, with the wrong smell. I could see Danny Ochoa in the corner with his notebook writing it all down. I set the plane down and walked back inside and washed my hands. Marlene looked up from her crossword. Something? She said. Nothing yet, I said. They're just slow. She nodded. She knew what yet meant. It happened on a Tuesday night, around 2:40 in the morning. I wasn't there. I want to be clear about that. I was asleep in my own bed, 38 miles away, with Marlene breathing steady beside me and the furnace clicking on in the hall. What I know about that night I know from what Danny told me later and from the incident report that eventually made its way, quietly, into industry circles. But I've been in enough tunnels at 2:40 in the morning to see it. So let me tell it to you the way I've seen it in my head, every night since. The night crew was 6 men's. Shift boss named Kettering. Decent operator, not one of mine, hired after I left. 2 ground techs, a muck boss, a maintenance apprentice, and the guidance system engineer sitting up in the cabin watching the screens. The screens were green. They had been green for the whole shift. The Cutterhead entered the yellow flag zone at 2:31 a.m. The geotech report had predicted a 30-foot band of mixed material, some clay, some fractured rock, possibly a lens of saturated sand near the crown of the bore. Yellow ground. Watch it. The software watched it the way software watches things. It saw the torque numbers rise. It saw the thrust demand climb. It compensated, bumped the pressure, adjusted the advance rate down a hair, opened the muck ports a percentage. Numbers held. Green stayed green. What the software could not see was that the Cutterhead was no longer chewing. He was grinding. There is a difference. A cutting machine that is chewing removes ground in bites. You see it in the muck, chunks and shear planes and clean faces. A cutting machine that is grinding is spinning against ground that is not letting go, and the muck comes out as slurry, homogenized, uniform, dead-looking. To a sensor, uniform is stable. To an operator who has been in a tunnel, uniform is a scream. At 2:38 a.m., the thrust demand spiked. The software compensated. The Cutterhead slowed by a rotation and a half per minute, but the system logged it as a nominal adjustment. No alarm. Green. At 2:39 a.m., one of the cutter teeth, a tungsten disc about the size of a dinner plate, sheared off. This happens. Teeth break. But in bad ground, a broken tooth changes the whole cutting geometry, and the machine starts to load asymmetrically. The neighboring teeth take more force than they were designed to take. 2 more went in the next 40 seconds. At 2:40 a.m., the Cutterhead bound. That's the phrase in the trade. Bound. It means the rotation stops. Not slows, stops. The thrust cylinders are still pushing forward, the drive motors are still pulling amps, but the wheel of steel at the face of the tunnel is locked in the ground like a key that is turned the wrong way. In a lock, the whole machine shudders. The shudder travels back down the length of it, back through the trailing gear, back to the operator's cabin, and every man in that cabin knows, in the space of one breath, that something has gone very wrong. The software, per Danny's later account, threw its first red light at 2:14 a.m., 14 seconds after the bind. Kettering, to his credit, killed the drive within 4 seconds of the red light. He didn't know what he was looking at yet, but he knew you don't feed thrust into a machine that isn't turning. He got on the radio. He called up tunnel. He called Carter Hill at home. Carter, I'm told, arrived at the site in 40 minutes, in pressed jeans and a jacket, hair still messy from bed. He walked into the trailer and looked at the screens and said, and I'm quoting Danny here, "What did you guys do? Not what did the machine do? Not what did the machine do? Not what did the ground do? What did you guys do?" They tried to reverse torque it. They tried to walk it back. They pulled the shift boss from the day crew out of bed and brought him down. They called corporate. They called the software vendor, who was in California and who came onto a video screen at 4 in the morning and said things about parameters and diagnostic sweeps and recommended a controlled restart sequence. Nobody called me. I want to say that plain. Nobody called me, and I would not have come if they had. Not that night. That was Carter's night. He had asked for it, and it had arrived, and no man walks toward another man's disaster uninvited. By dawn, the Cutterhead had not moved, not an inch. The tunnel behind it was silent, and the ground ahead of it was doing whatever bad ground does when it has caught a machine and decided not to let go. The water came the next morning. Danny Ochoa called me at 11:14 a.m. on the Wednesday. I remember the time because I was in the driveway loading lumber into the truck for the potting bench, and I looked at my phone and saw his name, and I set the boards down carefully before I answered. Some calls you don't want to be holding lumber for. Mr. Young, Danny. Sir, he stopped. He was outside somewhere. I could hear wind on the microphone and faintly the ambient roar of a job site. I'm not supposed to be calling you. I know that. You're calling me. Yes, sir. A breath. We lost her. Cutterhead bound last night. Bad ground, right where you said. Right where you said, Mr. Young. I'm sorry, Danny. Water started coming in this morning. About 7. A seam at the crown above the shield. We tried to seal it. We ran the annular grout. He stopped again. Kid was rattled. It's not sealing. There's pressure behind it we didn't model for. The tunnel's flooding, sir. It's up to the trailing gear already. They're pulling the crew out. I closed my eyes. I could see it. 600 feet under the ground, a mile back from daylight. Water coming up around the muck cars and rising toward the ceiling of a tunnel that no longer had a working machine at the front of it. Cold water. Groundwater. Full of the fines from the ground the Cutterhead had been grinding. Uniform. Nobody hurt? No, sir. Everyone's out. They got everyone out. Good. That's what matters. He was quiet a while. Then, Mr. Young, they're saying it's a total loss on the machine. They can't get to it. They can't free it. They're saying maybe they abandon this drive and start a rescue bore from the other end. But that's months. That's tens of millions. I know. I gave them your notebook. This morning. My notebook. The one with the logs. I gave it to the incident review team. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I didn't do it sooner. Danny, sir, you did it now. Sir, you did it now. That's the same as sooner. In these things, it's the same. He made a sound I think was almost a laugh, but wetter. Yes, sir. You go do your job. You be careful with what you say and who you say it to. This is going to get investigated, and you're going to be a witness, and witnesses who tell the truth, plain do fine. You tell it plain. Yes, sir. Danny, sir, you listened. Down there. That's more than most of them. You keep listening. You'll be running one of these someday, and there will be some kid standing behind you, and you'll teach him. He was quiet a long moment. Then he said, "Thank you, Mr. Young." I hung up. I stood in the driveway with the phone in my hand and the lumber at my feet, and I looked up at the sky, which was that gray October sky the Pacific Northwest gives you around then, low and soft and neither promising rain nor withholding it, and I did not feel triumphant. I want you to hear that. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired. I felt sad for the machine, first, which will sound crazy to you if you have never run one. But that machine had been my partner for almost a year, and she was down there in the dark now, drowned, with her teeth broken and her thrust cylinders cold, and nobody who understood her was ever going to touch her again. I felt sad for the crew, for Kettering, who was a decent man doing a decent job with tools he had been told to trust, for the 2 ground techs, for the ground techs, for Danny. I felt sad in a way I did not expect, for Carter Hill, because I knew, standing in that driveway, that his career had drowned in that tunnel too. He just didn't know it yet. I picked up the lumber. I put it in the truck. I went inside and told Marlene the tunnel had flooded. She looked at me a long time. Then she said, "You want lunch?" "Yeah," I said, "I'd like lunch." She made grilled cheese. We ate at the table. Neither of us said anything else about it that afternoon. The maple outside the window was full red now. The trade press picked it up about 2 weeks later. There's a magazine that covers our industry. Small circulation, mostly engineers and contractors, and the occasional academic, and they don't sensationalize. They can't afford to. Everybody in the industry reads it, and everybody in the industry knows everybody else, and if you get a fact wrong, you'll hear about it inside a day. So when they print something, it's careful. It's sourced. It says what it says. The article ran under a plain headline, "Millrace Conveyance Tunnel, Suspended Following Cutterhead Bind and Ground Failure. Losses estimated in tens of millions." Marlene brought it in with the mail. She didn't say anything. She just set it on the kitchen table next to my coffee and went back to feeding the cat. I read it slow, once through for the facts, then once through for what wasn't said, which in an industry article is always the more interesting reading. The facts. Cutterhead bound at approximately 2040 a.m. on the date in question. Attempts to free it unsuccessful. Groundwater ingress the following morning. Machine considered unrecoverable in current position. Project timeline extended by an estimated 14 to 18 months. Direct losses to the contractor estimated between $18 and $24 million, not including litigation exposure and client penalty clauses. A rescue bore under evaluation. What wasn't said but was there? If you knew how to read it, the incident review had found gaps in the pre-event ground condition escalation process. That's the phrase. Gaps. In the escalation process, meaning somebody had raised a flag and nobody had picked it up, meaning Danny's notebook had made it into the record. And then, near the bottom of the article, one sentence: the company's operations manager for the project, Carter Hill, has been reassigned to a corporate advisory role pending further review. Reassigned to a corporate advisory role pending further review. That is the industry's way of saying, this man will never manage a job site again. I sat at the table a long time with that page open in front of me. Marlene finished with the cat and came over and read it over my shoulder, her hand on the back of my chair. Reassigned, she said, dry as a bone. Reassigned. That'll follow him. It'll follow him everywhere, I said. There's maybe 200 people in this country who make hiring decisions on projects this size. They all read this magazine. Every one of them just read that sentence. She was quiet a moment. You feel anything? I thought about the question honestly. I owed her an honest answer. I always have. I feel sorry for him a little, I said. Not much, but a little. He didn't set out to sink a tunnel. He set out to save the company some money and get his name on a promotion, and he was too sure of himself to hear what the ground was saying. That's a real mistake. It's not an evil mistake, but it's the kind of mistake that costs. Now he's paying it, and I don't need to pile on. She nodded slowly. I feel worse for the machine, I said. She didn't laugh at me. That was one of the things I loved about her, in that moment and in about 10,000 others. She just put her hand on my shoulder and left it there a second, and then went to start the dishes. I folded the magazine. I put it in the drawer under the phone. On top of the badge, I'd never gone back to trade for the severance check. I did sign the severance eventually. The non-disparagement didn't bother me. I hadn't planned on saying anything anyway. Saying nothing was the whole point. That winter, I spent a lot of time in the shop. Cedar for the potting bench turned into oak for a chest Marlene had been wanting, which turned into a set of shelves for the grandkids' books, which turned into a bench for the front porch. My hands, after 31 years of hydraulic pressures and steel and diesel, remembered wood. They remembered it the way an old dog remembers a trail. Slowly at first, then all at once. I thought a lot about Frank Petralia that winter, about what he would have said. Frank was not a philosopher. Frank was a man with a 2-year technical certificate and a piece of finger missing, and a way of standing behind an operator that made the operator either learn or quit. He didn't give speeches, but he had sayings, the way old foremen do, and one of them came back to me over and over that winter, out in the shop with the wood shavings on the floor and the space heater going in the corner. Machines don't fail, kid. Machines report. What fails is the man who doesn't read the report. He used to say that at the end of shift, usually to whichever apprentice had done something dumb that day. It sounded like a scolding. It wasn't. It was a whole philosophy of the trade, wrapped in one sentence, and it took me about 10 years to understand it fully. The machine at Millrace hadn't failed. She had reported. She had reported. She had reported for weeks. The hitch, every fourth rotation. The muck coming out with the wrong fines. The uniform slurry. She had told anyone who would listen that the ground ahead of her was turning, and when nobody listened, she had done what machines do. She had gone as far as she could, and then she had stopped, and the only language she had left. Carter Hill hadn't failed either. Not exactly. He had done what he had been trained to do. He had trusted the data he had been given. The system had told him green, and he had believed green. He was a symptom, not a disease. The disease was older than him. It was the belief, spreading through every trade I knew, not just mine, that the map is the territory, that if a thing cannot be graphed, it does not exist, that the man who has stood in a tunnel for 30 years and can feel through his boots that the ground is turning is somehow less reliable than a sensor array that has been in the tunnel for 8 months and has never touched the ground with anything but a wire. I don't blame the computers. I never did. A computer is a tool, like a wrench is a tool. You wouldn't blame a wrench, but you'd blame a man who tried to hear with a wrench. I said that out loud in the shop one afternoon to nobody, and I felt a little foolish for a second. And then I felt Frank behind me. Not really, I'm not a superstitious man, but the way you feel a person you loved once, standing there, arms folded, that short nod he used to give when an apprentice finally said something true. I went back to my planing. It's spring now. Marlene's potting bench is done and out on the back patio, and she's got tomatoes started in little peat pots along the top of it. The maple is green again. My knees are the same, which is to say worse in the mornings and fine by afternoon, and my left ear still rings, and my hands are still my hands. Danny Ochoa called last week. He's moved on to a different project, a rail bore down in California. Good crew, decent contractor. He wanted to run something by me. A ground signature he was seeing in the muck reports, something the sensors weren't quite catching. I listened. I asked him 3 questions. He answered them well. Sounds like a lens of saturated silt about 40 feet ahead of you, I said. You'll want to slow the advance and increase the annular grout. Watch the torque on the outer cutters. They'll load first. Yes, sir. That's what I thought. Then that's what it is. He was quiet a second. Then he said, Thank you, Mr. Young. Anytime, Danny. I meant that. He calls now and then. I meant that. He calls now and then. He'll call again. And someday, maybe not too far from now, there'll be a kid standing behind him in a cabin somewhere, and Danny will fold his arms and wait, and the kid will reach for a control too fast, and Danny will cluck his tongue. That's the trade. That's how it moves. The badge is still in the drawer under the phone. I don't look at it much. I don't need to. I know what it says. It says Alexander Young, Senior Operator, and has my photograph on it from 1.5 years ago. And the man in the photograph doesn't quite know yet what's coming, but he'll be all right. I know because I'm him, on the other side of it, and I'm all right. The tunnel is still down there. They started the rescue bore in February. It'll take him another year, easy. The original machine, my machine, is still bound in that ground at chainage 2240, drowned in her own tunnel, with her broken teeth and her cold brush cylinders. I think about her sometimes. I hope, when they finally reach her, whoever cuts her free does it with a little respect. She earned that. Cutterhead, I hear, took a job with a management consulting firm. Not in tunneling. Something to do with logistics. I hope it goes well for him. I mean that. A man who has made a mistake that big either learns from it or he doesn't, and I would rather he learned. As for me, I get up when the light comes in the window. I make Marlene's coffee. I read a little. I go out to the shop. I plane wood. I answer the phone when Danny calls, or Marty, or one of the 2 or 3 others who still ring me up sometimes to ask about a ground signature or a torque curve or a hitch every 4th rotation. The computer runs the machine now. That's what the man said. He was wrong about that. But he was wrong the way most people are wrong about most things. Not maliciously. Just from not having stood in the right place long enough to know better. I stood in that place for 31 years. I know what I know. Closing reflection. If you take one thing from an old operator, take this. There is a kind of knowledge that does not fit in a spreadsheet. It lives in a nurse's hands when she palms a fever. It lives in a farmer's eyes when he looks at a sky. It lives in a mechanic's ear when the engine is idling wrong and he can't tell you why yet, but he will. It lives in an operator's boots when the deck plate hums a note it hasn't hummed before. This kind of knowledge is real. It has kept people alive and machines running and tunnels dry for as long as there have been people and machines in tunnels. And it is being quietly written out of the ledger, in trade after trade, because it cannot be graphed, and therefore to the men with the graphs it does not exist. I am not telling you to distrust the graphs. The graphs are useful. I am telling you that if you are ever, in any trade, the person who knows a thing in your hands that you cannot quite explain, trust that thing. Say it plain. Say it once to whoever is in charge. If they laugh, do not say it again. Set the badge down and walk out with your dignity, and let the world teach them the lesson you tried to teach them gently. The world always does. It doesn't hurry, but it does. And when it does, do not gloat. Do not celebrate. Somewhere in the wreckage, there is always a machine that deserved better, and a young engineer who was trying his best, and a foreman somewhere older than you who taught you what you know, and none of them would want you to be small about it. Be quiet. Go home. Plane the wood. The trade moves on to the ones who listen.